this book is about one of these important Asian waterways, and I argue in the book that this is really the world's most important river, and I'll explain why. I mean, we all know, I think, instinctively that rivers are fundamental to life, to civilization. Almost all the world's great cities are built at river mouths or river confluences or on river banks. From the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia to ancient Egyptian civilizations, and then we talk about cities, London, Paris, Cologne, Shanghai, New York, Edinburgh, where I was the other day. And I mean, even Singapore is basically built. It's an entrepot, obviously, at the crossroads of maritime Asia, but it's also at the mouth of the Jurong River, and even the little Singapore River has been. I was told when I met Singaporean people earlier this week, they reminded me that in 1987, I think it was 1977, Lee Kuan Yew himself called for a cleanup of the Singapore River, and 10 years later it was clean. And this is a river which is only a few miles long, so you can imagine how hard it's going to be and how much money it's going to take to clean up a river like the Ganga. And in fact, the other fact I learned the other day, I spent Tuesday in Kuala Lumpur. Apparently Kuala Lumpur means the confluence of two muddy rivers, which I didn't know about, but it proves the point about the importance of rivers. Before I get on to the sort of gloomy stuff about governance and toxic pollution and so on, I just want to, because I especially when I'm giving dinner talks, I always end up talking about toilets and sanitation because people ask questions about it, and I always try and veer more towards the cheerful stuff, but it is important to remember that the Ganges is a living river that is not dead yet, although some of its tributaries are. And the book is, to some extent, a celebration of the Ganges. It's not just a kind of lament about the state of the river, because it is not only the world's most important river, it's also probably the most famous internationally, as well as in India, of course. And it is reflected, as most of you know, in the from ancient times, the great epics of Indian literature like the Mahabharata, all the way up to modern day Bollywood movies. It's very much integrated into Indian culture, but it's also referenced in works of classical literature. It's been described by foreigners for more than 2,000 years. The first sort of Westerner, if you like, who we have a record of coming and visiting the river was Megasthenes in 302 BC. He was a Greek ambassador of Seleucus who came, and he described the river. He described some of the religious rituals that were happening along the river. And then we had Buddhist scholars from China more than 1,000 years ago, Fa Xian in the 5th century, Xuanzang in the 7th century, who wrote the great Tang dynasty record of the western regions. And then we had, a few hundred years later, we had the Muslim voyagers, very famous Islamic writers like al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta. And then we got on to the British. Ralph Fitch, in the age of Shakespeare, wrote a very graphic description of a trip down the river. French, Italian, or Portuguese, many different travelers have been down the rivers and described it. And one of the things that I that I always find remarkable is that the things that they described, some of them have disappeared, like Pataliputra 2,000 years ago, which is now Patna, the capital of Bihar, was considered by many people who saw it, the travelers who saw it, to be the world's most magnificent city. And today that is just Patna. And of course the remains of the city, of the great city, are barely visible. But some things that they described, you can still see today. Sanskrit scholars sort of remark on how similar the descriptions from 2,000 years ago are to what you see today. Ralph Fitch talked about people bathing in the river, saying good morning, Ram Ram. The whole sort of ritual of use of the river for religious and indeed for everyday purposes is very similar, and that continuity is quite remarkable. And it is not unique, but it's almost unique in India. Of course, in countries like Britain, where I'm from, we've kind of lost our worship of rivers that we used to have. And then we get on to the present day with these incredible religious rituals like the Kumbh Mela, which I went to, the big one in 2013, where we had something like 100 million people widely considered to be the world's biggest gathering of humans on Earth over a period, admittedly, of a couple of months, because people come and they go. But when people question whether or not there were really that many people there, whether there were really, twice the population of Britain visiting this one spot at the confluence of the Yamuna and the Ganga at Allahabad, I refer them to a study done by Harvard, where they actually measured the number of cell phone connections, and there's something like 77 million unique cell phone connections in that period during the Kumbh Mela. So there was clearly a very large number of people, probably about, at the very least, something like 100 million people. And the book also celebrates, and this, I think this is important not to forget this either, when I say it's a living river, the wildlife that you can find even today in the whole of the Ganges River system. A lot of people don't know, even Indians who live in or near the Ganga regions, the plain of North India, they don't know, for example, that you can see dolphins pretty easily. 2,000 kilometers, these are freshwater dolphins, but we're 2,000 kilometers from the sea, and you can see dolphins fishing. They're not active dolphins like the playful dolphins you get at sea, but you can see them pretty easily. I've seen them in Patna several times. I've seen them in other places near Varanasi and Allahabad and so on. You can see gharials, which are extremely rare, but you can see them on the Ganga, and particularly on the Chambal, which is a tributary of the Yamuna, which then goes on to join the Ganga. So it is still, as I said, a very sort of rich and living river. Now, why is it the most important? Well, of course, it's partly for spiritual reasons, holy to 1 billion or more Hindus in India and around the world. Ganga is a goddess who purifies. If you're a Hindu, it's where you want your ashes to be scattered, and preferably in Varanasi or Kashi, the city of light. And of course, I mean, India itself, but Indians by definition are river people. Most of you probably know this, but some of the audiences that I speak to don't. A lot of the sort of river worship transferred across thousands of years ago from the Indus to the Ganga. And India is derived from, the Indus River is the Sindhu, which simply is the Sanskrit for a large river. So the Indus River, Indians, these are essentially just river people. So India was the name given to the lands beyond the Indus. And so if you are an Indian, you are basically by name a river person. And of course, many Hindus will keep Ganga Jal, Ganges water in their homes, in copper pots, plastic jars, and you can buy it on eBay. I think you can even buy it on Amazon these days. But there's a sort of very important, and this is where we come to the sort of governance issues of the modern day. There's another reason why the Ganges is important, and that's because more people depend on the river than on any other river on Earth. Hundreds of millions of people depend on the Ganges and the water and the fertility that it provides to the fields. Probably about 1/10 of the world's population is really dependent on the continued flow of this river and the fertility supplied by the silt that it brings down from the Himalayas. And it's really the reason why, the Ganges is the reason why India has always been, until modern times, one of the wealthiest places in the world. It's why it was a target for the Mughals to come and invade. It's why the British wanted to take it over. This is the attraction of the thing. And it's also why this has always been one of the most densely populated parts of the planet. So if you look at the North Indian plain, the Ganges Valley, the Ganges catchment area, it's a huge number of people. It's Bangladesh, of course. It's a large chunk of North and even Central India, and it's southern Nepal as well. There's been a lot of talk about how China is reclaiming its place as the world's largest economy. But if you go back to the statistics of historical analysis by Angus Maddison, you'll see that India was possibly or probably an even larger economy. The GDP of India was something like a quarter of the world's GDP. I think I had the number here. It's 33% of world GDP in the 1st century AD, according to Angus Maddison, was India. China was 26%, and the whole Roman Empire was 21%. Obviously, those figures are extrapolated in rather complicated ways from available data. But the point is that India was at least a match for China in terms of the sheer weight and size of its economy. And Northwest Europe at the time was basically nothing at all by comparison. So yes, as one of the gurus I quote in the book says, the lives of 500 million people is not a small thing. I forgot to mention when I was talking about spiritual things, of course, it's not just Hinduism, it's also Buddhism, which is founded, again, in the Ganges Valley. And then trade, international trade was conducted from ports that have now disappeared and are basically forgotten, except by Indian historians at the mouths of the Ganga. The Ganges and the mouths of the Ganges in the Bay of Bengal were at a great sort of trading crossroads between, if you went east, you went to maritime Southeast Asia. If you went north, you went to Central Asia and China. And if you went west, you went to the Islamic world, and eventually, of course, to Europe, which wasn't very significant at the time. Ralph Fitch was actually an ambassador of Elizabeth I, and I think he wanted to see Akbar, and Akbar said, I haven't got the time for you, don't even know who you are, you're not a very significant person, and who cares about this great queen from across the sea who's only got 3 million subjects, or something like that. And I think Akbar at the time was ruling something like 300 million people. But the bad news, and there is bad news unfortunately today, is that this great river is under threat. Now, obviously there's a lot of data in the book, well, not as much data as I would like, because some of the data is not available, but about the types of pollution. You mentioned superbugs, there's a chapter on that, but there's also, of course, lots of other kinds of pollution that affect the river. I mean, very briefly, the worst problem, and probably the most difficult one to solve, is very simply human sewage. And you were asking about how many treatment plants there are along the Ganges. I don't have the precise number, but the generally used statistic is that only 10% of the human waste or the sewage that is produced along the Ganges is actually treated at all. There's a huge problem in India, which we can discuss if you like, about not just about the use of toilets, but even if you have a toilet, it may not be connected to a drain. The drain may not be connected to a sewage plant, and the sewage plant may not be built, and if it is built, it may not be working. And if it is operational, in some cases in recent years, we've had problems with no electricity because if there's a power cut, somebody steals the fuel. There are all kinds of problems that go beyond simply. A lot of people say it's a cultural problem. Indians don't want to use toilets. It's much more complicated than that. It's a huge infrastructural issue that we can talk about when we talk about governance. Then there's the issue of toxic industrial waste, which is a big problem, not quite as big as one might think, because India is not as industrialized as China. So there are heavy metals in the water. There are other industrial toxins that get in there. But unlike China, it's not hugely industrialized, and not all the industry by any means is on the Ganges or its tributaries. So that is a problem that I think is more manageable and amenable to solutions. Essentially, if you find the factories, and the Central Pollution Control Board will say, there are 767 large factories on the Ganges, and those factories can be tackled one by one, and the waste that comes from them can be treated and controlled. If governments and regulators and business owners have the will to do so. It's much more difficult to, and much more long-term, and costs more money to actually set up a whole sanitation system for India, which needs to be done. Then there's fertilizer runoff, there's pesticides. There's very, very little data in India about any of these problems. The pesticides, we sort of know indirectly because they've measured the blubber of the freshwater dolphins at the university in Patna, and they found extremely high levels of pesticide residues in that blubber, because they're at the top of the food chain there. But we just don't know enough about the toxins that are going into the water. And everything, most of the things that I was able to find out, I hope, are in the book. And lastly, in terms of sort of abuse of the river, we quite often talk about what we put into the water, but what we forget is what's taken out of the water, or what's taken out of the river, and that is essentially too much water. So at every barrage along the Ganga to make, to put water down a canal. Sometimes 80 to 90% of the water is taken out of the river for irrigation, and that leaves the river extremely short of water downstream of that point. So in the dry season, if you go downstream of campus, I think there's a stretch of something like 80 kilometers, which is often completely dry. And this is obviously a critical problem for a river. It's not the only river to have this problem. In Australia, you've got rivers that don't flow to their mouths. The Indus, of course, has the same problem. But it is becoming a problem in the Ganges as well, just the lack of water. And this is a much broader problem, and there is a chapter on this as well, of drought and overuse of water. The water table is, which of course has a sensitive relationship with the river, is sinking in very large parts of North India, particularly Punjab and Haryana, but across North India there are millions of tube wells, otherwise known as boreholes, that are sucking the water out and that's being used for irrigation. And there's a huge crisis, so that in some parts of the of North India, essentially in the dry season, places become uninhabitable. Farmers simply can't make a living there, and there's nothing to do, and they migrate to the cities. This is one might think, this is foreign environmentalists crying wolf and complaining about the state of a river in a foreign land, and they should all go home. But fortunately, and when I've given talks to audiences in India, I expected to be sort of condemned and told to mind my own business, but actually I found audiences, especially of young Indians, incredibly responsive to this problem. And it's worth remembering that Narendra Modi himself, the current Prime Minister of India, whatever one may think of his views on religion or politics, he made a very big pitch to save the Ganges when he stood for election in the last general election. He stood as MP for Varanasi for political reasons, but also for cultural and historical reasons, Varanasi being the sort of the heart of Hindu India, if you like. And he stood on the banks of the river and he said, "Ma Ganga is screaming for help, and I have been called by God to save the river." And I thought that was encouraging, because I thought, like a lot of people who observe India, whether they're Indian or foreign, and again, whatever one thought of his political views, most people thought that Modi would at least be more effective than his predecessor governments in getting things done in terms of infrastructure. And since he committed himself to do that for the river, we all thought, or many of us thought, that he might actually get something done. And indeed, he stood on the walls of the Red Fort, and again, his enemies were, I think, slightly taken aback by this in 2014, on Independence Day 2014, and he said, "I'm not going to talk about fancy things, I'm a poor man, I'm going to talk about sanitation, the need for toilets." A lot of people have forgotten that, and that was a remarkable speech, I thought. It was his first Independence Day speech, and he also made a commitment to women's rights, but he made a commitment to sanitation, and he said, "We have to do something about this, and you may not want to hear this, and it may not sound grandiose, but it's something that we need to do." Now, the bad news, of course, is that if you look at the record of what's actually been achieved in the 4 years since then, the answer is pretty poor. I haven't studied other parts of the economy so much since that time, except up to about 2016. But on the river, the evidence is pretty clear that by no means all the money that's available has been spent, and the money that has been spent has indeed been largely wasted. And this is not my opinion. This is from organizations like the Comptroller and Auditor General's report on the river cleanup campaigns, and indeed the Central Pollution Control Board came out with something the other day showing that pollution in some places had actually got worse, not better, and so on. So there is a huge problem, as I think most of us know, with implementation. So it's fine to have a government policy that says you're going to do something, but if you can't implement it, if the central government and the state governments and the people on the ground cannot get it done, then of course nothing has happened. I kind of have two. At a dinner last night of Indian Singaporeans, somebody said, "Well, let's find out who's an optimist and who's a pessimist." And I'd say about 2/3 of the people there were pessimists. These were all people from India or of Indian origin, and about 1/3 were optimists, and that's probably about right. But I do have two strong reasons for optimism. The first is that when you go to these Indian religious festivals, they're incredibly well run, and they're run by the same corrupt and useless governments that can't run cities on an everyday basis. So the Kumbh Mela is the classic example. This is a huge undertaking. You have millions of people living in a city that is built in 2 or 3 months on the sandbanks. When the monsoon ends, the water levels fall. They look at the sandbanks, at the confluence of the Sangam, of the Yamuna and the Ganga, and they say, right, we're going to build the city here for the festival, for the Kumbh Mela. And within 3 months, you have a city with roads, with electricity, with clean water, with sanitation, law and order. You know, they have to make sure that people don't drown because it's very hard to control massive crowds of people, and the police in India are very good at doing that. And all this stuff happens. There's food, there's health centers, and it's remarkable how few people get hurt or get sick in this period of mass migration from across India to these cities. And to me, it shows that that things can be done if people put a mind to it. In fact, the Harvard University team that was there that I mentioned on the cell phones, I think they wrote a book, or they compiled a book called something like "Pop-Up Megacity," and I quote that in my book. The other reason for optimism is that India is not unique in having rivers that are polluted. Now, that may sound obvious, but it's easy to forget that, of course, we know about Chinese rivers being filthy, but it wasn't only China. You had, I mentioned the Singapore River, rivers in Malaysia were disgusting. In my last book about Southeast Asia, I sort of compared the environmental disaster of Southeast Asia as it then was in the throes of industrialization and modernization to the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And when I was the examples I use of successful cleanups are basically the Thames, the Rhine, and the Chicago River. When I was a kid living in London, younger than when I was living in Khartoum, my mother, when we were walking along the riverbanks of the Thames, my mother said, "Don't fall in that water, because if you fall in that water, it's so disgusting. You'll have to go to hospital. Your stomach will have to be pumped." And I remember thinking, "Well, I'm not going to swim in that river," which is the way a lot of people feel about Indian rivers today. And the Thames has been polluted since medieval times, and it's only in the last 50 years that it's finally been properly cleaned up. The headquarters of my office is currently on the banks of the Thames, and river water that was completely dead in the tidal Thames from pollution is now thriving. You can see cormorants fishing under Southwark Bridge, where our office is, and I've seen kingfishers, and you even get marine mammals wandering up the river by mistake. I mean, this is a remarkable transformation. So in other words, it can be done. It's not an impossible task. The Thames, of course, isn't as big as the Ganges, but it is a fairly substantial river. The Rhine, same thing. The Rhine is complicated because it runs through many different countries, so it's not easy to manage a cleanup campaign, but nevertheless it was done. The European countries concerned got together and they spent tens of billions of dollars on sewage treatment, the restrictions on toxic industrial waste, and they succeeded in controlling the pollution in the Rhine and making it a river that can now be swum in, and the water can be used for drinking and so on. And this is a river that in the 19th century was so disgusting and smelly that Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote a comic poem about how awful it stank in Cologne. So it can be done. And last example, when Modi went to see Obama for the first time at the White House in September 2014, they discussed environmental issues, they discussed climate change, and they discussed rivers. And Obama's from Chicago, so he said, "Well, I'm from Chicago, and the Chicago River used to be disgusting, so rivers in the American Midwest used to catch fire because they were so polluted by industrial waste. The Ganges did once as well." and Obama said, now the river's being cleaned up. It's not perfect, but it's now so clean that you can have fish in it, and you can catch the fish, and you can eat the fish. And Modi said, that is exactly what I want for the Ganga. And the problem we face today is that it hasn't really happened yet. He hasn't got it yet. I think I'll leave it there. I mean, just to say that this is a story of the river, but it is also, I hope, a way of looking at modern India and its successes, for example, in environmental management, but also its failures in environmental management and in other areas like infrastructure. So thank you very much. And I'll just show a few pictures as well. Can I, where do I point it? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so, I better sit down so you can hear me. I won't spend too long on this, but because some of you probably know much more about the river than some of the other audiences who sort of need to be shown what it actually looks like. But this is, the book very roughly starts at the source and ends up where the Ganga meets the sea in the Bay of Bengal. And this is the upper reaches of the Ganga. This is the, let's see, so this is the glacier with Gomukh, the mouth of the cow, and this is obviously in the foot, this is about 13,000 feet up or so, and this is Bujbas, which is about 4 kilometers from the source. And this is the great glacier from which the Ganga is traditionally deemed to come. There are other source rivers as well, and of course there's always disputes about what is the true source of a river, but this is widely agreed to be the true sort of traditional source of the river. I'm afraid that's me. I don't normally like having pictures of myself, but I just wanted to show the actual glacier, and this is the mouth of the cow here. Actually, it's not a very good picture of the mouth, but that's the. If you go a little bit to my left, you'll see, you can actually see better that it really does look like the mouth of a cow. And this is the face of the glacier. Huge kind of blocks of ice fall off this into the freezing water. And I did not actually bathe here, but my guide, who is a very religious man, decided to bathe, and I was pretty amazed that he emerged because the water is about 0 degrees centigrade and it's full of ice. And now we're just moving slowly downstream. This is in Gangotri, and this is Swami Sundaranand, and he's complaining about climate change, which is obviously a big issue, and also about environmental abuse for the river. He's an interesting character. He knew Edmund Hillary and other people like that. He was a photographer as well as a bit of a mountaineer himself. But he says that Gangotri, or the glacier, has receded. I mean, in his own. He's in his 80s now, but since the time he's settled in Gangotri, he has seen the glacier recede by about 3.5 kilometers, I think he said. Every evening, there's in the summer months before the winter, there's a nightly prayer ceremony on the banks of the Ganga here in Gangotri at the temple. This is where the image of Ganga is kept, the goddess, and then she's moved in the winter downstream to Harsil for the winter months. That's a map for those of you who don't know. The interesting thing about the Ganges is that unlike most of the other great rivers of Asia, it does not rise in the Chinese-controlled Tibetan plateau, except for the Brahmaputra, a very important distinction. This is the Brahmaputra, which is in some ways a bigger river than the Ganga, and that does rise in the Tibetan plateau, and indeed is being dammed in many places by the Chinese. But the Ganga itself rises just inside Indian territory. There's Gomukh, there's Gangotri, where we got to in the pictures, and then it sweeps down across North India. So that's Narora, Kanpur, where a lot of tanneries are, which put a lot of pollution into the river, industrial pollution. Allahabad, where the Kumbh Mela was in 2013. That's the Sangam, the confluence of the Yamuna and the Ganga. Varanasi, Patna, and then we get to the Bangladeshi border here, the Farakka barrage, which diverts quite a lot of the water down into the Hooghly, which is therefore still navigable, and there's Calcutta, and then Dhaka here, and these are the sort of mouths of the Ganges, the great delta in the Bay of Bengal, where you end up with this huge mangrove, the biggest mangrove swamp in the world right here. and that's Delhi. So the Yamuna sort of runs parallel to the Ganga, rises quite close by, and then comes down here parallel. And this area between is the Doab, very fertile river, extensively irrigated by canals that were built by the Mughals and then also built by the British later on, and still irrigated by masses of water from the Ganga and the Yamuna. And that's the map. But the area is quite huge. I mean, this is all the the catchment area of the Ganges here. This is the confluence of the Alaknanda and the Bhagirathi at early in the morning. Climate change, very, very significant for this is the Himalayan tsunami of 2013, June, when there was a massive flash flood which killed about 6,000 people. Pilgrims were just swept away, temples were swept away, bridges were swept away, bulldozers. The river changed course. It was a huge catastrophe which not many people outside India really remember, but it was a massive disaster in the summer of 2013. And of course, like all events, you can't attribute it directly to climate change, but you can say that this kind of incident is made more likely because the weather was very warm, and instead of falling as snow, this precipitation fell directly as rain quite high up in the Himalayas. So instead of falling as snow and then melting slowly, it fell as rain and just swept down the source streams of the Ganges. This is Rishikesh, and this statue of Shiva was swept away shortly after this picture was taken. Now we're in Rishikesh again. This is one of the ashrams. This is Parmat Nikatan ashram on the banks of the Ganges. I don't know if any of you saw the BBC three-part series with Sue. I can never remember her name. Yes, Sue Perkins. So this he features. This is Swami Chidanand Saraswati. He features in one of the videos, and he's kind of cleaning up plastic from around the ashram and so on. And he's quite environmentally minded and tries to save the Ganges and plant trees and that kind of thing. Now we're just heading rapidly downstream. This is just above Haridwar. Now we're at the Kumbh Mela. These are the Naga sadhus who get to go first. I won't, for this audience, I needn't go into too much detail about what's going on here, but they have priority on the first day of the Kumbh. And now we're Hastinapura. This is just to give an idea of how much rubbish there is in the dry season on the river. In fact, when I got to this point, we just passed a sort of ceremony of people who were doing a religious ceremony. They were dancing and bringing water from the river, and they'd left behind all their plastic plates and stuff on the river. There's that sort of sense that plastic doesn't really matter, and you can't sully the Holy Ganga. But as you can see, sadly, you can sully the Holy Ganga rather badly. Now we're heading towards central North India. This is the fort at Chunar, and at this point the river sort of sweeps north, and it was a very hot day, and you can get depressed about the Ganges, but then if you come somewhere like here, you can see that it's still, parts of it are pretty pristine, and in fact I saw some dolphins pretty much right here from the walls of the fort, just fishing peacefully in the river here. Now we're in Varanasi, Benares. I'm sure most of you have been, but if you haven't, you have to go. It's the most extraordinary sight at dawn. A lot to see and do. This is the boatman's temple in Varanasi, next to the cremation ghats. This is the boatman who ferried Ram across the river on his way to rescue Sita. This was just to show people how present Ganga is in modern day culture. It's not just a historical traditional thing. It also shows you that the Indian censors were less strict in 1985 than they are today. And this is Ram Your Ganges is the god Ram Your Ganges is sullied, and it's a wonderful sort of allegorical tale. It's also got some great Bollywood songs in it. But it's a wonderful allegorical tale because this is in fact Ganga herself, and she represents the river, and she is abused all the way down when she goes to look for her loved one, who's that weird guy there with the little hat. He's got a sort of alpine hat, which is rather strange. But anyway, and she is, she's abused by corrupt holy men, by corrupt businessmen who try to sell her. She's nearly raped by a sort of dodgy priest. It's really a kind of adventure of an allegorical tale of hardship, and then she eventually finds her man, I think down in Calcutta, and the evil businessmen are not only trying to abuse her, they're also trying to abuse the river by building paper plants and making the river dirty and so on. This was around the time of the first Ganga Action Plan, I think, under Rajiv Gandhi, a plan that also had no impact whatsoever, unfortunately. And this is a slightly more modest version of Ganga at Narora Barrage. We're still heading downstream. I'm a bit of a keen sailor, so apologies for this. This is what the British and the Bengalis used to use. These are budgeros for sailing up and down the river. That's Modi, I mentioned, on the walls of the Red Fort, 2014. This is the Yamuna below Delhi, so disgusting that the water at this point can be 500,000 times more, have 500,000 times more fecal bacteria than is permitted by the Indian bathing water standard. That's a lot. I mean, that water is basically pure sewage, unfortunately. And that's what goes to Mathura and Agra down the Yamuna from Delhi. Yeah. And when the Yamuna comes into Delhi, it's pretty clean. And the reason is that there's very, very little effective sewage treatment in Delhi, unfortunately, even today, because of things like this. I mean, this is what comes out. It's not treated, it's just dirt. It's plastic, but it's also sewage, and it's also industrial waste. I was talking about drought and the water table. This is a village in the Bundelkhand, which is in the sort of central part of North India. And this village is basically almost uninhabitable in the dry season because there's only one well that has sweet water. All the other wells, and I tasted them, the metal pumps, they produce salty water that is undrinkable and probably no good for agriculture either. So there's one well, which is this well, which is built in Mughal times, and that's the only well for a village of 3,000 people. And the great thing about India, as any of you will know, who've done research there, is that nobody's afraid to speak, unlike in some countries in Asia. And if you go into a village like this, people will immediately come up to you. Actually, the woman that really confronted me is not in this picture, but people come up to you and say, "Oi, you tell Mr. Modi this, you tell Mr. Gandhi that. Rahul Gandhi came here and he didn't do anything, and you tell Mr. Modi he's got to come here and give us water." So it's a wonderful place to do research as a journalist, or I think as an academic as well, because everybody will tell you exactly what they think, and they will tell you exactly what they think needs to be done, and there's no problem of shyness, put it that way. Whereas if you've ever been to a sort of conference with an audience of Koreans, we all kind of live in terror that no one's going to ask a question at the end, and I'm sure that that won't be the case here. This is just to show how this was in, I'm trying to remember which year, I think it was 2016, April. Could have been 2015. So this was when there was a Jat protest in Haryana. And for the first and only time during my years living in India, apart from operations in Kashmir, the Indian government sent in the army because the protesters, nothing to do with the protest particularly, they were protesting about job reservation and university place reservation for different castes and so on. But they sabotaged the canal as part of their protest. And the government immediately sent in the army and shot some of the protesters, and started restoring the canal, because Delhi, it turned out, is dependent on water that is imported from rivers a long way away, as well as from the Yamuna, and hundreds of kilometers up in the foothills of the Himalayas. And I think some of it comes from the Sutlej. This is the Munak Canal, the main water supply for a mega city of 25 million people. And even at the best of times, those of you who've lived in Delhi will know, I lived in one of the most prosperous parts of central Delhi, and we used to get 2 hours of water a day that dribbles into a large tank at ground level, and then you pump it yourself onto your roof, and that's it. If you don't get that 2 hours of water a day, you haven't got any water. And that's the richest people in Delhi. So obviously the poor much more deprived of water and often have to buy it from gangsters who have water tankers and so on. So water is a huge problem, and Delhi is very dependent on water from elsewhere. And this was just to show that. There's the wildlife. This is a painting by a East India Company painter called Sitaram. There's a lovely book of his paintings. They were discovered in somebody's attic a couple of years ago, and I think the British Museum published this book of his paintings and engravings. And this is it's actually, it says, I think the painting is called The Crocodile and the Grasshopper, although it actually looks like a cricket. And that's a gharial from the Ganga. And this was just to show that you can actually see gharials today. They're incredibly rare, incredibly endangered. But if you go to the Chambal, just a few hours south of Delhi, they are quite easily visible in the river. And that was the one that, well, I saw a whole bunch of them actually. But and I'd lived in Delhi for 4 years before I even knew that the Chambal had all these extraordinary things in it: birds, gharials, dolphins. And it's just a few hours from Delhi now that you've got the highway going down to Agra. Now we're heading rapidly towards the sea. This is the Hooghly, just to show that this is a trading river as well. The government has talked a lot about, the current government has talked a lot about recreating the Ganges and the rivers of India as a kind of trade highways. Not much has happened yet, but there is some freight that goes up and down the Ganges, and that's the Hooghly. Calcutta, that's the Ganga Sagar annual festival. Again, same story as the Kumbh Mela. The good news is that although the West Bengal government is notoriously corrupt and inefficient in many ways, when it comes to organizing this sort of thing, they're remarkably efficient. You know, no plastic is allowed in the water. They're very strict about enforcing it. There are toilets, and there's a constant barrage of public announcements, which is actually quite disturbing, but it just means that these things are ruthlessly well organized in a way that you don't often see in regular Indian life. These are the Naga Sadhus again, and this is where the Ganges essentially meets the sea. And this is one of my favorite pictures, because these are Baul minstrels, and I was with my Bengali-speaking colleague who was helping to translate for me, and I said, and there was this crowd of people listening to these wonderful musicians, the sort of haunting songs. And I said, this is beautiful, what are they singing? And she said, they're singing, use the toilets and wash your hands afterwards, otherwise the goddess will be angry. So it turns out they're actually government, they've been hired by the government, they've got these kind of passes, you see, to sing a propaganda message. But, you know, it's good news in a sense. It's not very romantic, but it's good news because it means that, again, the government is trying to enforce proper rules, which it doesn't do the rest of the time. Now we're in the Sundarbans, the great mangrove swamps of the Bay of Bengal. These are people collecting honey from the Sundarbans, where they're often at risk of being killed by man-eating tigers, in fact. The Sundarbans is the most extraordinary sort of landscape of swamp and wildlife, and very sort of flat, green, quiet, but eerily beautiful, in fact, in a completely different way to the upper reaches of the Ganga, which are also eerily beautiful, but in a very different way, obviously. And then we head down towards the open sea, where the Ganges meets the Bay of Bengal. So thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you may have, and we can probably have a discussion, right?
Yeah,
thank
indeed.
You. Thank you.
We're open then for, thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm sorry, I always forget, we clap in Singapore, we don't clap in Australia.
Oh,
that's why the Australians are non-clappers. But
oh, really?
That's
Do you clap when you land?
no, we don't clap.
I mean, in an aircraft.
A little prayer, perhaps. Yeah. We're open for discussion, and I see from our timetable we've got about 20 minutes before we break for informal discussion and afternoon tea. So open for questions, comments. Yeah.
Maybe this is an ignorant question. How does one clean a river of this scale? And what I mean is, you know, not just like purely scientifically, but also because it's so, there's like a populist angle to that would be different than the Hudson River or the Thames, where you have a lot of industrial, you know, complex around it. This is millions of people who are unpleased.
I love this question in a way, because the great thing about rivers is you don't need to clean them. You just need to stop dirtying them. You know, so it's easy to forget that, but the moment, because rivers flow, it's not like a lake. The moment you stop putting pollution in the water, below that point, the river is clean. I mean, you can argue a little bit about toxic, heavy metals in the silt of the river, but essentially, the moment you stop polluting a river, it's clean. So it flows cleanly thereafter. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean you don't actually have to scrub the river. What you have to do is you just got to be systematic. And the problem with Indian governments is that they're not systematic, certainly not in implementation terms. And state governments are corrupt, and they're not very effective at doing things, and municipal governments have no power and no source of finance. My belief is that what you need somehow to have a system where a city or a village or a local area has a stake in what happens. If you had a powerful government in Varanasi that could say, we need a sewage plant here and we need to build it this year and it needs to be finished by next year and then it needs to run and we're going to charge people or whatever and it's going to run for the rest of its days, that would be great. It just doesn't happen. What happens is that the central government gives budget to the state government, which in the case of Uttar Pradesh and Varanasi is more than 200 million people. It's a country that's bigger than Brazil in terms of population. And then the money gets stolen, or it gets wasted, or both. And there's just not enough sort of implementation capacity or will at the local level to get things done. So that is the big challenge. As I said, I think it's easier to deal with industrial pollution because you can just target a company and say, stop putting waste in the water. But it is a matter of the regulators actually enforcing the things. The Central Pollution Control Board, sad to say, is a pretty useless organization. They keep putting out these statistics about the number of liters of waste that factories are putting into the river. It's a meaningless number. That waste could be highly toxic, concentrated heavy metal, or it could be water. We just don't know. And I don't care how many liters of waste go in. What I care is what is in the liters of waste. And that's the kind of figures that you need to have. So they supposedly have real-time monitoring of all these outlet pipes, but it's no one knows if they really report it or whether it works. And the World Bank has finally managed to spend a tiny bit of the $1 billion or more that it has waiting to go into the Ganges, and they are starting to put in real-time water pollution monitors. I think they measure about 20 or more parameters of water cleanliness, and that's supposed to be real time, but the data is not always freely available to ordinary people. So there's a big problem. First we've got to get the data, then you've got to make a plan for cleaning up, for stopping the pollution, and then you've got to implement it. And India falls down particularly on the last score, but actually even on the data and on the the planning, it's not very good either, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes, Jivanti and then Deepinder.
Thank you very much. I don't know very much at all about this subject, but if I'm not mistaken, on the implementation front, a new sort of portfolio was created for this Ganga rejuvenation project, and it was first given to Uma Bharti.
Uma Bharti, who was exceptionally useless. Sorry,
exactly.
Am I allowed to say that? But she was, yeah.
I mean, now
yeah.
I think it became given to Nitin
Gadkari.
Gadkari, and there was a lot of hope that he's one of the better.
I agree, yeah. No,
so has there been any improvement?
That's a very good question, and I've been saying exactly the same thing, that he is considered to be more effective, especially in infrastructure projects. And if you talk to business people who work in India, they say he has actually done things with roads, and he has been effective, and therefore we'll hope that he will be effective or is being effective in cleaning the river. But yeah, I mean, so far, I'm not aware of any evidence that shows that he has been effective. But that does. I'm not saying that means that he cannot be effective or will not be effective. It may be that in a year's time we'll see some numbers, some real numbers. There's a huge problem with data, fake data as well. But maybe we'll see some real numbers that will show that actually he's starting to make an impact. And no one would be happier than me to see that. I mean, because I care about this river as much as anybody, and I think it is possible, because it does depend a lot on the people. There was a very good water secretary, I'm not sure if he's still there, called Shashi Shekhar, who was brilliant. He knew completely what needed to be done, and of course his problem was getting it done. With the resources at his disposal. But yeah, Uma Bharti was definitely not good. She was very ineffective. She didn't know anything, and she didn't do anything actually. So even Modi, who had put her in there, got rid of her. But hopefully Nitin Gadkari will do it. The problem with Nitin Gadkari is that he has a lot of other portfolios. He's still transport minister as well. And he also had, I mean, interestingly, he had this very ambitious plan to make the, river linking and to make the Ganges this transport hub with roll-on, roll-off ports all the way up the Ganga. I mean, nothing of that has happened as far as I'm aware. So ambitious plans, but no result yet. Yeah. I mean, just one very brief thing. If this could be seen as not as a sort of environmental project to please the Greens of the world, but as an essential health project of sanitation, of which, and the byproduct of this sanitation project, which would save the lives of hundreds of children. I mean, hundreds of Indian children every day die because of poor sanitation. Completely unnecessary diseases, diarrhea, stuff like that. Hundreds of children a day are dying. I mean, I think when Jairam Ramesh was minister, he said it was 500 children a day. That's a sort of jumbo jet or more of children every day dying of preventable diseases across India. But half of those would be in the Ganges, the Ganges basin. And if that could be done, one byproduct of that would be cleaner rivers across India, which would be great. But the more important thing would be that, people wouldn't have to die unnecessarily. So somehow the government needs to sort of use that. I mean, Modi talked about sanitation and the need for it, and he knows it's important. And he just hasn't been able or willing or whatever to implement it. And it's not about lack of money, it's about getting things done.
Dependent.
On the same note, how are the responsibilities allocated between the union government, the states and the local government, and the resources? Is there an overarching authority that's monitoring? And is any institution actually that's sort of metrics to assess what's been going on?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, my understanding of the Indian system, and some of you may have much better sort of knowledge of this, but under Modi and even before, quite a lot of power and indeed finance is kind of devolved to the states. And most people would say that the states, or many of the states, actually some of the South Indian states are quite effective at spending money, but some of the North Indian states are not effective at spending money. So you've just got a problem where you just distribute all the money to the states and then the money is wasted. In terms of regulators, you've got the problem the Central Pollution Control Board is not a very effective organization. The state pollution control boards are even worse. I mean, they're sent to monitor the river, they just come up with fake numbers. I mean, nobody believes the numbers. Because, you look at the data and it's like the same every day. How can it be the same every day? Somebody has just filled in the gaps in the data. They haven't actually bothered to measure it, and they're not paid to measure. It's horrible. So there's a big problem. And as I said, I think the lack of sort of effective municipal government, except perhaps in Delhi or Bombay, effective, but more effective than, or more having more power is a real problem if you just don't have that local government. Yeah.
There's nobody coordinating as such.
Well,
Central government.
You have national government projects, but I mean, the most notorious example is back in 2001 or so. There was a national sanitation program, and UP, Uttar Pradesh, got $600 million over 10 years to install toilets across the state. And every year they reported improved rates of toilet coverage. So 2001, it went from something like 20% and went up and up and up every year, success. By the time they got to 2011, it was 80% coverage. Fantastic news. Except that the census authorities did a census in 2011, and they're not beholden to the state government of UP, and they measured the number of toilets, and lo and behold, it was exactly the same as it was in 2001, so 20%. In other words, the UP government and its officials, either at the senior levels or the middle levels or lower down, had not just stolen 10% of the money and built some toilets, they'd stolen all the money and built no toilets. So that is, in a nutshell, is the problem. Yeah.
We've got there.
Yes. Thank you. I might be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, last year there was some legislation passed which sought to give the rights of a person to the rivers or something along those lines. Has that policy had any effect in your...
No. I mean, I'd like to say yes. I mean, one of the features of India that I found sort of amusing is that every week the National Green Tribunal or the Supreme Court, most recently the National Green Tribunal, which is a sort of environmental overarching court, would issue an edict, and they would say, you must stop polluting the Yamuna. And I mean, do you think it had any effect? Of course not. So, I think it was the Supreme Court of, or was it the High Court in, there was a court, and then I think it was then reversed. Didn't somebody say it couldn't be a person or something? But anyway, the problem is that Delhi High Court, okay, but declaring this is not the same as doing it, And no, I think the problem is that a lot of policy, a lot of would-be policy in India is declarative, not actual. So the court is always saying, you must not build here, you must not do this, but there's no enforcement. If you don't have an enforcement capability, and the regulators are the same, the regulators will say you must stop doing this to the companies or the municipalities, and nothing changes. You need to have actual implementation and then actual enforcement of the rules. And Singapore, of course, is notoriously good at that kind of thing. And India is notoriously bad. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And somehow that difference needs to be bridged. Yeah.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is a problem with the basic structure of the Indian Constitution,
Yes, I
which
feel
was
so,
based
yeah.
on the 1935 Government of India Act, which is a
So it's our
colonial
fault.
era problem.
Yeah.
And it boils down to the fact that the Government of India Act of 1935 was meant at crippling the provincial governments and,
Yeah.
and giving them responsibility for all social spending.
Right.
But all the revenue raising authorities with the central government.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
the same thing that persists to this day.
But to be fair, Modi has actually devolved
He's
some.
devolved some.
Some
So
part, yeah.
it's increased from 36% to 41%
Right, yeah.
of
Yeah.
central government revenue being devolved to the states.
Yeah.
So there's a bit more money coming through.
Yeah.
But the actual money is raised by the central government.
Yeah.
And the spending, the responsibility for spending, and particularly on all the social sector issues, health, nutrition, education particularly, and stuff like this, is with the states.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who
absolutely.
don't have, who have very limited
Yeah, and they
capacity
don't,
and
yeah.
incentive to
Yeah,
do.
yeah. They don't have the absorptive capacity, and you're absolutely
Yeah.
right. I mean,
So I'm
yeah.
interested in what
Yeah.
your solution to that. I mean, what your proposed
Well,
solution.
I'm not a sort of constitutional lawyer or expert, but I completely agree with you. And I think the issue is you need to have local or provincial or state governments, state governments that have a stake in it. So they need to be able to raise the money themselves, and then they need to be able to spend the money themselves. Now, that's not just a matter of policy. You've also got to have, as you mentioned yourself, the capacity to deal with that money, to raise the money, and then to spend it wisely. And, all these things, I mean, this is a massive long-term project, and of course it also depends on huge investment in the education system. And one thing we haven't discussed, but is very significant for natural resources and for all kinds of resources, is the demographic pressures. India is very quickly on its way to becoming the world's most populous state. At independence, when people were already talking about pressures on natural resources, the population of India, of what is now India, was something like 350 million. It's now more than 4 times that. So the pressure on water and all resources and on government capacity is huge, and it's still rising. So Bihar alone, I think, adds the population of Australia every 10 years. This is really, really hard to deal with for any government, however effective. So Singapore, where we are today, is it's probably less than Patna, and it's just a crisis that, you're right, but I don't have a solution, and I think you would need a very, very bold Indian government to kind of push through some massive constitutional reform like that. But I think probably most people would agree it does need to be done. Yeah.
Hi.
You mentioned?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, we got another. Yeah.
A very quick question. Basically, I just wanted to know about the water quality statistics. You said it's really difficult to find.
Yeah, it is.
As with most of the rivers in India, the Central Pollution Control Board used to come up with annual reports.
Yeah.
And it is a very organized system now as compared to what it used to be beforehand. However, now particularly it becomes very difficult to access the data.
Yeah.
Yeah. and they look at many,
Yeah.
whether the ISP is international or Indian, because they have also inhibited many NGOs working on, international NGOs working
Yeah.
on Indian economy and all that. So there's a huge amount of change which has come over time. But to my very basic question is, if you're asking a social scientist to conduct a very basic social science research project and call Ganges a polluted river, on what basis you're defining it? Is it based on purely biological oxygen demand, as you said, basis of sewage, or is it a chemical oxygen demand, or it's a composite of all?
Yes,
So
yeah.
how do you define water quality in your book? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I mean, on the data first, it's hugely complicated. I mean, the most recent data I could get for the book, which I finished, I guess, about a year or so ago, was from 2011. So that gives you an idea.
There are many things
Now,
which has come after that.
there is more.
Yeah.
Well, there is other data, but it's very hard to access. Now, the World Bank is producing this data,
Yeah.
and at the time that I wrote the book, it wasn't. Well, first of all, the monitors were not yet in place, and secondly, the ones that were, and there were a few in place, but they weren't actually letting us have the data. And I'm not quite sure whether that was the World Bank or the Indian government or both. But in terms of defining pollution, that's a really interesting question. Now, I don't say that the Ganges is a highly polluted river, and one reason for that is that it's such a complex issue. Most people have this idea that there's a river. Maybe I should go back to the map, but they have this idea that there's a river, and the more pollution you put in it, the more polluted it gets. But of course, it's not that simple, because you get the addition of tributaries which have which have massive amounts of clean water. The Brahmaputra is pretty clean, and it's
There's
pouring
a huge
in.
amount of
Yeah.
volume of water in
Yeah.
the Brahmaputra. It
Of course,
can't even
of
be
course.
compared. That's
Exactly,
why, yeah.
and then you've got other tributaries that are coming from Nepal that also contribute water. You've got the Ramganga high up is very clean, lower down it's very polluted.
Okay.
Some of it is diverted, I think, above Moradabad by canal to go into the mainstream of the Ganga. It's a hugely complex issue. So you have patches where the water is very polluted and patches where it isn't. What I would say is that some of the tributaries of the Ganga are so highly polluted as to be dead for large stretches, and that's a problem. That would include the Yamuna in particular below Delhi, but other rivers as well, and other rivers in India, even those not in the Ganges river system. And the one thing that the data that the CPCB clearly shows is that there is more pollution, and includes BOD and COD and so on, above a city than there is below the city, and that's very simply a function of the fact that there's a lot of sewage coming from each major city along the Ganges. But you cannot sort of say that the river gets more polluted or less polluted. It's in patches, clearly. So there are patches where there's no water at all in the dry season. There are patches where it's pretty polluted with industrial pollution. There are patches where it's pretty polluted with human sewage. There are patches where it's relatively clean. It's true, obviously, that if you go right to the source and swim there, there's very little fecal bacteria, and then of course you go.
You mean upstream?
Yeah, upstream.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, and near the source of the river, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very complex pattern, and you could probably model it, and you'd end up with a very colourful and complex picture that you could sort of show on a computer screen, but it's quite hard to show in a book. And I certainly wouldn't claim to be comprehensive, to have a comprehensive database, or indeed to sort of comprehensively explain where each part of the river system, and this is a massive river system, is good or bad. But you can see anecdotally, you can see where it's bad. Below Patna, it's pretty vile, and and then it's seasonal, of course, as well. One of the things that makes the Ganga such a complicated river to manage is that the wet season flow can be something like 100 times the dry season flow. Whereas rivers in northern Europe, for example, they do have seasonality, but nothing like the variety that you have in India, where the monsoon just adds this colossal amount of water, and then the dry season, dries it all up again. So you have, and climate change is going to worsen those extremes by causing more extreme rainfall in the wet season. And if the glaciers melt and the snow cover melts, there's going to be very little supply of fresh water in the dry season. So you'll have drier dry seasons and wetter wet seasons, and that is clearly not a good thing and makes the river even more difficult to manage. So I hope that sort of half answers your question. Anyway, yeah.
We'll take one.
You mentioned the
more.
Rhine
Yeah.
and how it passed through many countries,
Yeah.
but they managed to
Yeah.
get it cleaned up. That seems like a parallel to India's situation where the Ganges passes through many states. Is there any parallel? I mean, what did they do in the Rhine? They must have had so much coordination to do.
Yeah, they did. They had a
lessons?
they had a trans. You could argue that this exists in India as well with Namami Ganga. But they had an international body for the states through which the Rhine flows, and that body coordinated the response. And it was financed by the various governments. Obviously, it was easier in the sense that this was kind of post-war Europe where people were inclined to be cooperative with each other, but it all worked, pretty well. I think I'm not a sort of super expert on the Rhine. Obviously, I was more interested in the Ganga, but it was an example. I mean, actually, India, it's not between, as you know, the Ganges is not between nation states except Bangladesh, and in the case of some of the tributaries, it is also you've got Nepal and you've got China, but essentially it's India and Bangladesh for the main stream of the Ganges, and that's been problematic in itself. But in terms of pollution cleanups, it's really India that's the issue, because by the time you get to Dhaka, you're very far downstream, you're right, the cooperation will be between the states, but national governments in India have the power to bang heads together, and there are, most of these campaigns to clean rivers ever since 1985 have been national campaigns in which the central government plays the leading role and then allocates sort of funds and projects to the states. And again, constitutionally, I don't know how that how that plays out or whether it was challenged or whatever, but typically these are national campaigns done at the central government level and therefore don't have the problems of coordination between states that you would get otherwise.
I think with that we'll call the proceedings to a close, the formal proceedings, but we will move to the outside for afternoon tea. Victor, thank you very much for coming, for bringing the book. It's also, I think your agents are very
special cheap price outside.
Enterprisingly, you've brought some.
Buy river
on the
books for
table
Christmas
outside.
and all other festivals. Thank you.
So please join me in thanking James. Victor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very kind of you. Thank you.
I get all the tea people up next door.
Oh no, James Crabtree. Yes,
Well,
is
you're
yeah.
the same ilk.